I'm doing my presentation for Senior Capstone on business ethics. As you can see in the cartoon, there's a business manager depicted shoving the annual report, the draft of the employee's annual report back at her, and he says he'd like fewer facts and more fiction. In other words, he's prepared to doctor the books to make his organization seem a little bit more profitable than it actually may be. Business ethics is relatively difficult to define, although here are two different definitions of business ethics. The first, the rules of conduct recognized in respect to a particular class of human actions or a particular group, culture, or organization. The second, essentially, paraphrasing, says that it's about the moral judgments, the moral standards, and the moral codes of conduct. Basically, business ethics is choosing to do what's right over choosing to do what's wrong. My problem statement for the portfolio, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, it essentially stated that because of today's economy, it's extremely competitive, it's extremely difficult to get consumers to buy into your product. And so, in order to help their organization, some executives feel the need to try and do unethical things in order to curb expenses and increase profits. Oftentimes in those practices, the executives are placing employees in a very difficult situation where they're having to kind of choose between what's right and what's wrong. In other words, their employees are faced with an ethical dilemma. Here's another cartoon. This kind of illustrates an ethical dilemma. Here's an executive sitting, and he's got an angel and a demon on his shoulder, and he says, how will we handle this? In other words, he's faced with choosing between what's right and what's wrong. This is an example of an ethical dilemma. The purchasing manager for a large company agrees to give you a much-needed order there first, expecting you to agree to make a $200 donation to his favorite charity, a local youth sports team. How do you respond? Consider the consequences for both making the donation and for not acquiring the customer. So on the one hand, if you as the sales manager decides to go ahead and make the donation, what you're essentially doing is you're setting yourself up to having to do shady business with this potential customer each time you do it. Every time that you want his business, he's going to say, well, I'll buy from you if you do this for me. That's not necessarily a good precedent that you'd want to start. On the other hand, if you don't accept the bribe, which is essentially what that is, if you don't accept the bribe, you don't get the sale. And if you don't get the sale, you don't get the commission, your organization doesn't get that customer, and instead, a rival organization acquires that customer. So really, here again, it's a situation, the ethical dilemma presents really the lesser of two evils. There's no correct answer. It just is based on the organization's kind of their policies as to which they would prefer. This is another example of an ethical dilemma. You and a coworker are working on a project when he makes a major mistake. You spend extra time in the office to fix his error and finish the project while he leaves at his regular time. The next day, your manager compliments both you and the coworker on your completed project. Your coworker simply accepts the compliment without pointing out his error or your extra work. There again, how do you respond? I wrote, consider the consequences both professionally and socially. First, professionally. If you turn your employee in or rather point out his mistake, it gives you the upper hand. It gives you an advantage. Your boss will see that you're a hard worker and that he might be a little bit shady, and if there's a potential promotion in the future, you might have the upper hand for that promotion. On the other hand, socially, if you end up turning in your coworker and kind of pointing out his mistake, then you may be looked around the office as a whistleblower or as someone that can't be trusted. You might have a more difficult time making friends, but you may advance your career more rapidly. There again, there's no correct answer. It's an ethical dilemma that oftentimes employees face, and they have to choose the lesser of two evils. For my literary review, experts divide the major issues with ethics into four major categories: the relationship between business and consumers, the relationship between employers and employees, the special forms of business, and I focus primarily on the corporation, and the nature and the value of financial markets. I'm going to talk about each one of these things individually now. The first, business and consumer relationships. no matter what the product is, the ultimate success of the organization is going to come down to the relationship between the consumer, or in this case, in the business and its consumers. Both sellers and buyers can be unethical. For example, the buyer can be unethical because he can advertise or market his product knowing that it's inferior in nature. He can go ahead and make a slant that looks great for his product, knowing full well that his product may cause harm, may be inferior, may use poor product, whatever it may be. On the other hand, consumers can be quite unethical, and they can, as in our example of the ethical dilemma, they can ask for bribes. They'll say, well, I'll buy from you, but I want a discount, or I want some sort of a kickback on the back end of our deal. Most discussions of the moral problems in business-consumer relationships focus on specific issues, such as advertising. There again, false advertising, telling the consumer that your product is something that it is not. The use of bluffing and bribery in negotiating. I might say, as the buyer, I might say to the seller, well, I'll only buy from you if you sell it to me at this price. Company B is selling it to me at $100, and you're trying to sell it to me at $120. So unless you give it to me for the price that I'm asking, I'll use company B. So there again, they're kind of not necessarily bribing, but they're really putting the seller in a difficult position. The setting of prices can go both ways as well. Consumers can kind of get together and they can say, we're not going to buy that product for over $100. And what that's going to do, if all those consumers stay on the same level and they all agree to those terms, is it's going to cause the buyers, they're going to have the upper hand, and the seller is going to have to come down to their price. On the other end of that, a lot of times, and most notably, and a good example I think would be like gas prices. All the gas prices, the buyers are going to set a price, and they're going to stick to that price. Consumers have no choice then but to rise up and pay the price that's being asked. Some employer-employee relationships, these are really probably one of the most common issues, and it's kind of all-encompassing. There's a lot of different aspects to employer-employee issues, one of which, do employers have the right to test for drug use? It's a big privacy issue. Some people think that if it doesn't affect their job or their performance at their job, then they should be able to do whatever they want on their own time. Another privacy issue, do employers have the right to monitor employees' emails, phone calls, and internet usage? I know in particular there was a case where an employee was fired for applying for other jobs while at work. He was sending emails and his resume out to other employers while he was on the job. In other words,